Okay, so we're going to move on for part two of the faith oppression lecture. So in the previous video for this lecture, we talked about um, the five phases of faith oppression. So now we're going to move on into what does faith oppression look like in the United States. So remember, with faith oppression, we're focusing on Christian hegemony and these practices that are implemented at different levels of society within US America. So let's jump into it. So faith oppression has been documented in US American history. In the previous video, we talked about the ways in which the Puritans engaged in some violent practices against people who were non-Puritan. We saw the oppression and marginalization of indigenous peoples and of African slaves, where they were forced to leave behind their cultural identity, their spiritual beliefs, um, and forced to learn about the Christian God, right? So taken together, excuse me, taken together, faith oppression has been documented in the past, in the earlier parts of US American history. We've also have documentations of faith oppression in modern US American history. So since 9/11, uh, since that event, there have been higher reports of hate crimes towards people who are Muslim and Jewish folks, as well as people who are Sikh and Hindu. So taken together, we have seen the marginalization of religious minority groups. So when considering the indigenous and African slaves, right, the indigenous American folks were uh, forced off their land, and uh, there was the there was the attempted extermination of indigenous American folks. And then what we saw was this this creation of Christian missionaries coming into these tribes and forcing Christianity onto them with the African slaves. Remember, we talked about folks who were Christian, white European folks who were Christian, taking taking African slaves onto these plantations, forcing them to forget their cultural identities and beliefs, and this includes their spiritual beliefs and the forced learning of the Christian God, right? So we have seen that with these groups. We've also seen divisions amongst Christians. So what I mean by that is when we look at folks who are Catholic, uh, there was a lot of anti-Catholic rhetoric during or really throughout US American history. We've also seen the marginalization of people who were Quakers. So basically, anybody who was non-Puritan during the earlier parts of US American history, they were, while they might have been Christian, there was the belief in that Christian God. They were marginalized based upon their differences in their division, or differences of that particular division from the majority faith, the majority mainstream Christian faith. We have seen the marginalization of folks who identify as Muslim. So earlier in US American history, when you had folks from different parts of Asia coming over into the country, they were forced to, not, first off, they were exploited for their labor. And at one point in time, there was an act that banned Chinese folks from, or folks from different parts of China, uh, and also Asia, from becoming an immigrant in the US America. And there were some folks who were of the Muslim faith that experienced that marginalization. They were denied rights. in modern U.S. American history, we see a lot of Islamophobia, and I say this in the best way possible. There has been a lot of allowances of Islamophobia in the mainstream media, right? So for a long time, you saw a lot of conservative stations talking about this thing called Sharia law. While folks in U.S. America, well, in the mainstream, spun that, it did not mean what it was meant. So that's something important to make note of. We've also seen a rise in hate crimes against folks who are Muslim. Now, as far as other non-Christian faiths, so this includes folks who are Jewish, folks who are Hindu, who are Sikh. We've also seen a rise in hate crimes against those folks. We've seen synagogue burnings. We've seen the beating of people who are wearing Sikh headgear, so like the turbans. And it's also important to note, we do have the marginalization of non-religious groups, right? So folks who were identified as free thinkers, as atheists, they were seen as godless. They were seen as immoral and not good humans. During that time, what was found, not during that time, but up until this point in time, there are a lot of negative stereotypes against people who are atheists and agnostic and just non-religious and non-spiritual in general. Folks consider them to be immoral. They're evil. They tend to be weird. So taken together, when we're looking at folks who are non-religious, none of that is actually true. Within U.S. American history, faith oppression, the way that it's construed, it suggests that in order for a person to be a good human, you have to have a God. You have to believe in a God. And if we're continuing along the lines of Christian hegemony, you have to believe in the Christian God for you to be good. So there's this equation with faith in the Christian God and morality. If you have faith in God, if you believe in God or a God, then you are moral. You have a set of values to follow. And I want to be clear, that's not true. You don't have to have faith, and you don't have to have faith in order for you to be a nice human, a kind human, a loving human. And when we look at folks who are atheists, we do have, specifically atheists, we have research to show that people would not vote for atheists as presidents just because they were atheists. We also have some laws that ban and prohibit people who identify as atheists for running for office. So taken together, with faith oppression, we've seen it has done a good job of portraying atheists as angry, godless, and immoral folks, when in actuality, that's not all true. So with faith oppression within the US, we are marginalized and exploited, in some cases, inflicted violence upon people who are non-Protestant Christians. So we're going to continue on with faith oppression in the US. So just looking at Christian hegemony, right? Remember that Christian hegemony is like these cultural assumptions and norms and beliefs that are centered around Protestant Christian origins. So let's start talking about Christian hegemony at the interpersonal and individual level. So this is the most basic level, right? This is where an individual is operating and they have their interpersonal interactions. one thing that's operating at this level is Christian privilege. And remember, Christian privilege is basically the privilege you have for being Christian. There are certain things that you don't have to think about when practicing your faith. Naming also can be a concern. Depending upon some folks, folks who do not identify with the Christian faith, those specifically those who are Muslim, there are certain names that people would associate, would negatively associate, right? So with those names, people tend to be afraid and they tend to make these assumptions, right? Remember the video for Wednesday, right? The speaker talked about these different things, and one of them is like how about your name. And as soon as people learn something about your name or they hear your name, they act a certain way towards you. And that's what we have found when it comes to folks with folks who identify with certain religions, and their name. Clothing is also really important, right? So let's think about a person who is Jewish and they want to wear a Star of David. That's part of their faith. However, with anti-Semitism, folks who are Jewish are more likely to be hesitant around that. Thinking about folks who are Muslim, specifically Muslim women, when they're wearing the hijab or the burqa, right? Folks do target them based upon their clothing. People who identify as Sikh, when they're wearing turbans, there have been reports of people who are Sikh and who have experienced hate crimes, specifically beatings and name callings, right? So taken together, looking at the individual and interpersonal level, we privilege people who are Christian and we marginalize people who are non-Christian, specifically non-Protestant Christians. Operation at the systemic level, this gets really interesting now. So from what I can see, majority of the people within US Congress, right, identify as Christian. And it's important to note that because of their Christian privilege, they can cite their faith as means for laws in their ideologies. And that's a problem. So let's think about that. We have this thing called separation of church and state. And is it not important that a person who is proclaiming their faith as part of their moral ground for certain laws, which impact people, right? Is that concerning for separation of church and state? I make an argument that it is. And at the same time, the system doesn't do a good job of reprimanding this faith, this one faith under all, right? And it favors indirectly favors Christians and marginalizes people who are non-Christian or non-Protestant Christians especially. Religious institutions. We have seen religious institutions play out in political systems. Way back in, I'm not saying the ancient world, right? Like medieval times, you saw the interactive relationship between politics and political institutions and the religious institutions. You still see some of that today, right? You might have a lot of pastors of these megachurches, right? Donating to political campaigns, donating to I'm hearing my train, not my train, but Ruston train, the train in Ruston. Um, you see a lot of folks who are within these religious institutions donating money for lobbying, right? So when we look at it together, we still see that interactive nature between the political system and the religious institutions. And we're going to talk about this specific group called the religious right in a minute. But taken together, we do see this operation of these religious institutions. And I'll be clear, it wasn't only in like the 1960s, 1950s, 1940s, 50s, and 60s that you saw like religious institutions stepping away from political systems. They're still doing it now. Um, so, for example, you had a lot of evangelicals during the 1950s advocating for segregation, right? And at the same time, while you did have Christians who were citing against segregation, you still had evangelical Christians coming in and saying, no, our God wanted it to be separate and stay separate. It's wrong against our faith, and so forth and so on. Okay. Now, when we think about gatherings, that's also another story, right? So in some public institutions of higher learning, you do see the saying of prayer during sporting events. So taken together, right? Taken together, you're still not seeing that separation of church and state. Now, if the academic institution that's being attended is a private religious institution, then that's something completely different. And yet you still do see people praying at academic institutions, right? Just as examples. We're also seeing this visibility of Christian nationalist organizations, and also at the same time, the marginalization of non-religious groups and organizations as well. So let me go back. So I moved too quickly. So taken together, we do see a lot of, there are reports of Christian nationalist organizations on the rise. Now, it's important to note that this does intersect with race. So we have seen a lot of white Christian nationalist groups on the rise. And once again, when it comes to folks who are non-religious, right, we do tend to see that marginalization, that they cannot participate in certain levels, right? So, for example, I cited a study about folks' hesitation to elect an atheist for president. So when we look at it as a whole, folks do find, with the research that we have, there is some research to suggest that there is, excuse me, let me back up. So there is evidence of anti-atheist bias and stigma. There is substantial literature that does like document people's attitudes towards atheists. And to be quite frank, it is negative. There is also laws that prohibit people who are atheist from engaging as a political leader. You also see the discrimination of atheists for adoption. So I want to be clear, when we look at non-religious folks, when we talk about it, we simply just like make a quick statement and then move on. We do have research to show and document that folks who are non-religious are marginalized and they experience stigma. Now, I mentioned a couple lectures ago that folks who are typically non-religious and atheists are white, cis, man identified, and rich, right? It's also important to note that there are people who are not out as atheists or as agnostic or on the non-religious spectrum. And think about that. So imagine you are still, you're still closeting your atheist or non-religious identity, right? And you're hearing the rhetoric about people who are atheists. And you might be a person with multiple marginalized identities. What we do see when it comes to people of color who identify as atheists, they do experience this weird outing, right? Not outing as if they're being outed, but they experience something interesting. So while they're in these atheist spaces, it's predominantly white. And while they're in the Black spaces or spaces of color, they are, it's predominantly Christian. So taken together, when we're looking at the non-religious, it's important to not only just don't look at one group and say if atheists are predominantly, excuse me, don't look at it in a way that atheists are all white. That is not true. Instead, while atheism is predominantly white, there's an argument that folks of color or folks with marginalized identities or multiple marginalized identities are just, they might experience stigma from identifying as atheist. So just going over once again the historical overview of US faith oppression. So this is just more like a review. There are documented patterns of faith oppression. When we look at the Crusades, persecutions, and genocides, a lot of people died, right? A lot of people who were non-Christian died during these patterns. Now, I do want to be clear, for some time, there was a point where Christians were persecuted in Christian history. However, it wasn't until we saw Constantine switch things up with Christianity. And when he made Christianity as like the major religion, you saw this flip where Christians were doing the marginalizing, not the other people. And if anything, it was very interesting time, right? So now it's weird because when we switch over into US, into the historical patterns of faith oppression in the US, we see like the emergence of US, we see like this emergence and dominance of the Christian faith, specifically at that time, Puritan. And I do want to be clear, while people, there's this common suggestion that typically in discourse that we say that the country is founded upon Christian principles. It depends on who you're talking about. Thomas Jefferson was like basically the folks who were scientists were saying that religion wasn't important, science was. Now, if we're looking at the history of the Pilgrims and the Puritans, right? Yeah, that's the discourse that was put out there. So I want to be clear, it depends on who you ask, because the country was originally built on like basically the people who were sent over were like were predominantly criminals and prostitutes, so forth and so on. That's something that they don't really tell you in US American history. I learned that in college, and that was an interesting part to learn. But taken together, what we do see, excuse me, what we do see is the marginalization of, not marginalization, but the privileging of Puritan faith. All right. So intersections of race and faith. When we look at Protestant Christian, It has been historically racialized. So when we think of the acronym WASP, um, I'm not talking about the non-human insect wasp. I'm talking about the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, right? So basically, this is like the privilege of the most privileged. Now, let me go back. When it comes to Christian faith, in particular with non-Protestant Christians, we do see that is more predominantly folks of color, if not a little bit less than that. But when we're looking at Protestant Christians, historically they have been white. And so when we think about that intersection, right, folks who were white and Christian were also typically rich. So taken together, WASP has like that historical connections to white folks, white European folks who were rich. Remember when we talked about the history of colonization and the results of that? So remember that resulted in the marginalization and the attempted execution of Indigenous American folks. And you also saw the marginalization and exploitation of African slaves. And the justification for these marginalizations and exploitations and violence towards these groups was justified on Christian principles, right? There were parts of the Bible that justified slavery and the exploitation and marginalization of Indigenous folks and African folks. You've also seen the justifications for race-based segregations based upon biblical scriptures. So I mentioned earlier evangelical Christians. There are parts in the Bible, depending on the version that you're looking at, that references like the importance of non-mixing between races. And to be quite frank, throwing this out there, when you look at the translations of the Bibles, and especially in different versions, when you're translating that from hand to from reading to hand, people do tend to get tired. There have been some reports of mistranslations, misinterpretations, as well as folks making grammatic errors as well. So just throwing that out there as well when it comes to these justifications. Yeah, just throwing that out there. So now we're going to look at Christianity in current day within the law, education, and policies in the United States. So early in US American history, there was this emphasis on religious freedom. So when the Puritans came into the game, they were fleeing from religious persecution. And what we saw was the accommodation of folks who were Christian. Now, the Puritans, while they weren't the only Christian sect, they became very powerful. And with Christianity, it served as like the umbrella for like an identity. Those who didn't identify as Christian, they were suspected of being atheist. And as a result, they were either killed, tortured, or like exiled. Years later, we did have this notion of separation of church and state and the First Amendment. So the funny thing about it is when it comes to the separation of church and state and the First Amendment, it does prevent a single mandated faith. However, it didn't prevent hegemonic Christian repudiation of non-Christian practices. So when we're looking at the legal system and with communities of faith and non-faith, we typically see that there's a lot of favoring and preferences for Christian communities. So thinking about "In God We Trust," we have that on our dollars, right? Um, we also reference the Pledge of Allegiance, one nation under God. And it's important to know that this was not added until like 1955, and in the late 1950s, during the time when the US was having beef with the Soviet Union. And they considered the Soviet Union as godless folks, as a godless nation, and their folks were godless, right? It is important to note that during a time, there was the implementation of state atheism within the Soviet Union slash Russia. So it's important to note that that did happen at a time. However, what the United States was trying to convey was that because we are united underneath one single God, the Christian God, we are American. And that's where we started to see like this national identity of being associated with Christian faith. So continuing on with the legal system and faith and non-faith communities, we've seen the promotion of interests of the states. It's important to note that this also indirectly promoted interests of Christianity. So when we look at bills such as the heartbeat bills, right? When these bills were signed, governors mentioned that they do believe in the right to life, but they also have cited they've cited like their morals and values being that every life is important from womb to tomb. Well, looking at the Christian faith, that is also making that same promotion. Now, I'll be clear, there are other faiths that do state that the right to life is from, everybody has a right to life, and that that life is there at the moment of conception to the moment of death. However, Christianity is taken more into favor and interest compared to the other faiths. We've also seen the denial of rights of people with non-Christian faiths. So remember when we talked about the requesting for wearing certain headgear at work, not headgear, but headwear, and folks saying no, folks in the court saying, no, you can't do that. So let's piece it apart. It's appropriate to wear, for some folks, a Christian headwear, right? But it's not fair. It's it's unconstitutional. Not unconstitutional. It is inappropriate for someone of a non-Christian faith to wear their respective headwear, right? When it comes to school, we've seen like a lot of things going on with schools, right? So if you're in Louisiana, within the past recent years, you've had a lot of people urging for the promotion of creationism, of Christian concepts into public schooling. And remember, we have separation of church and state. Now, recently, Louisiana government has passed that this album that refers to the Christian God be placed into public schools. So in essence, what I'm getting at is notice the ways in which there is the citation of the Christian God, of Christianity, into public schooling. And at the same time, would we be still having this conversation if someone who was someone of Islamic faith wanting to put their reference to Allah onto something within public schooling? We would not. There's also the urgings for promoting creationism into public schooling at the same time as well. Holidays. So when we think about holidays, most of the holidays within the work week, and I say within the work week, think about our institution, right? We have a winter break. It centers around around Christmas, right? Christmas in the modern times now is in reference to the Christian faith. However, it was not always like that. So going back to Constantine, in efforts to make the his people united, all the holidays were basically changed to fit Christianity. So the pagan holidays were transitioned over into Christian holidays, Christian-based festivals, and so forth and so on. So when we think about Christmas, Christmas was actually originated within the pagan holiday. It wasn't until we saw this changing that changing towards Christian faith, that it became associated with the Christian faith, with the Christian God. Also, when we think about other holidays, right? Our spring break, it's typically in reference to Easter, I say Easter, Good Friday, Holy Thursday, Good Friday, right? So people do get off for that. Also, when we think about other holidays, like think about Valentine's Day, there's a lot of references to the saint associated with Valentine's Day. So, and these are just smaller examples. And it's important to note that for the work week is basically geared towards folks who are Christian. So the work week is Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday, and then Sunday is for where folks are off and in celebration or in accordance to the Sabbath, right? But taken together, when it comes to holidays, like the ones that I listed, there's a lot of references to the Christian faith compared to other faith, non-Christian faith holidays. So now we're going to talk about the religious right. And this is really, really important. So the religious right are these different coalitions between, it consists of fundamentalist Protestants and some very, very conservative Catholics. And with the religious right, there's this promotion and collaboration on reducing ideologies and concepts that threaten their religious convictions. I'll have a link in the notes to talk a little bit about that. So please make sure you watch that. It's really important that you do. What we have seen with the religious right, they're very visible. We see them in mainstream media, and we've also seen how much efforts they put into the political system. We do see anti-LGBT and transgender vitriol at the systemic and interpersonal levels. There are a lot of political attacks on pro-LGBT and transgender policies. And then we also see the denial of public business services. So a couple years ago, we saw a baker who cited that they could not serve a same-sex couple because it was against their faith. We've also seen the businesses that are very Christian-based, and they're also the main folks at the top are also donating that money into anti-LGBT campaigns, anti-transgender campaigns, so forth and so on. Now, about a couple months ago, Chick-fil-A used to donate the proceeds to fund these campaigns. Since then, they have reported that they stopped. And it's important to note that while that company can stop their own donations to their to these specific to these anti-LGBT campaigns, with the places where they're buying their chickens from or so forth and so on can also fund these things. So if you're looking at it, while they may not be directly contributing to campaigns, they may have ties to other companies that do. So let's think about that for a quick minute. That's very possible. We also seen like Christian businesses like Hobby Lobby come into places, right? We have a Hobby Lobby here in Ruston, Hobby Lobby in Monroe. So just throwing that out there. Public schooling. So with the religious right, we have seen like this promotion of creationism into schools, more Christian concepts into public schooling. And this is like in direct violation of separation of church and state. And then we also seen the undermining of women's rights. When we think about abortion laws, right? For a long time, abortion was illegal. It was really hard for women or people with uteruses to have abortions. And now what we're seeing is the impact of the religious right onto women's right, especially when it comes to abortions. So making it harder for women to get, or excuse me, not women, but people with uteruses to get abortions. So taken together, when we're looking at Christianity in law, education, and policy, we're noticing that it's very much rooted in there. Christian hegemony is rooted in there. So what are the steps that we can take to reduce that and to address it? So I mentioned we're going to talk about stereotypes, right? So when we look at stereotypes, when we're looking at Christian hegemony, it does influence and facilitate the stereotypes. So when we think about people who are Muslim, what are the common words that you hear? What about people who are atheist? What about people who are Buddhist? So a lot of times when we're looking at certain faiths and non-religion groups, there's a lot of negative stereotypes. So when we're looking at, when we're thinking about media, the mainstream media, we do see a lot of the promotion of negative stereotypes of non-Christian groups and the positive stereotypes of Christian groups, right? So that's something really important to note, and something that I would challenge you to question when you hear things about atheists being angry or all Muslims being terrorists, because we all know that that's not true, okay? So what are the steps that we need to take to reduce and even further, like I make the argument, to eliminate faith oppression? Number one, we have to talk about the diversity. And there's so much diversity when it comes to faith and non-faith communities. I included some little statements here. When we make these blatant statements, basically it's undermining the diversity of these communities. The statement that Buddhists are nonviolent and that atheists think religion is ridiculous. To be quite frank, that's not all true. Not all Buddhists are nonviolent, and there are some atheists that believe that religion might be helpful for folks. I know I make that argument as well. It's specifically, it's how in reference, it's basically, really, it's the way in which religion is used. So when we're looking at Christian hegemony, it's the way in which religion, the Christian faith, excuse me, go back. It's the way in which the Christian faith is being used. Um, the point is, when we're looking at faith, a lot of actually, I say a lot, when we're looking at the raw forms of these different faiths. So when we're looking at the raw form of Christianity before it got to Europe, Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, they're all faiths of peace. They're all getting at the same thing. They're basically saying that don't be an asshole, and that there is a God, or there's gods, or there's something out there. That's basically what the main point of all these different faiths are saying. And also, if you find that you're a good human with or without faith, or you're the human that you want to be, if you're being the nice human that you want to be, and that's with faith or without faith, do you. And let other people do them. If a friend comes up to you and says, and this is going a little bit into number 4, if a friend comes up to you and says, hey, yo, I'm an atheist, it's important to listen. Don't, you have that reaction, but is that reaction the implicit bias, or is it how you really feel? So think about that for a couple moments, and reflect on it. We also want to challenge Christian privileges, right? Where do these in what ways have these privileges helped you when it's come to, your faith and so forth and so on, or your Christian faith, if you are Christian? Whenever we talk about Christian privilege, have you thought about, saying prayers in public? Have you thought about being careful of making references to your faith? Or non-faith? Well, really, faith. And we also want to challenge the dominant narratives about marginalized faith and non-faith groups. So we've seen in mainstream media the ways in which marginalized faith communities and non-faith communities are portrayed. Atheists are portrayed as angry people who are just depressed all the time and who experience some kind of trauma. Jewish folks are perceived as these greedy people. Muslims are perceived as terrorists. And so it's really important to challenge that narrative and think to yourself, hey, is this all of the truth? And it's even harder to do that within your families. But remember, taking it one step at a time is really, really important. And like I mentioned, it's in several other lectures, know who you are first. Do you really believe in what you believe in? And if you do, then let that guide you, and move from there. If you're moving through your own morals, do you? Unless it's like killing another human, don't do that. Don't do that. We also want to have this inclusion of voices of those beyond Abrahamic faiths. So it's very common to hear about, hear the voices of Christians, of Jewish folks, and of Muslim folks. It's also important to recognize that folks who are Buddhist, folks who are Sikh, Hindu, pagan, so forth and so on, right? They don't get a lot of love in the media, and when they do get love, it's shitty. So it's important to include those voices into these narratives as well. So we talked about a lot of different things here today, but we mainly talked about the ways in which Christian hegemony operates within US America. And then we also talked about um, the more extreme forms of the more extreme groups that are engaging in this hegemony. And we talked about some steps. So that's it for this lecture.